The people of Mill Creek often spoke of the man who lived alone in the mountains. They called him the Mountain Man. No one really knew his story, but everyone had one to tell. Some said he was running from something. Others said he had simply gone mad from being alone for too long. But whatever the reason, he was a man people kept their distance from. His name was Elias Turner. He lived far beyond the edge of town, where the dirt road turned to rock and the trees thickened so much that sunlight barely touched the ground. His cabin stood by a quiet river that carried the sound of rushing water down through the valley. The cabin wasn't much, just a single room built from logs with a small porch and a stone chimney that always sent up a thin line of smoke when winter came. Elias had built everything with his own hands. The furniture, the fence, even the small bridge that crossed the stream behind his cabin. Every piece carried the marks of a man who had once known how to work hard for the sake of something or someone he loved. But that time was long gone. He lived by a rhythm only nature could give him. He woke before dawn, chopped wood until the sun rose, hunted or fished when he needed food, and spent his evenings mending tools by the fire. His only company was his old hound Rust, who had gone gray around the muzzle but still followed him everywhere, loyal and quiet. People in town rarely saw Elias, except for when he came down once every few weeks for supplies. He would walk into the general store, nod to the shopkeeper, and buy what he needed: flour, coffee, salt, maybe a spool of thread or a few nails. He didn't talk much. He didn't stay long. Children who saw him would whisper behind their mother's skirts, saying he looked like a bear who'd learned to stand upright. And in a way, he did. Broad-shouldered, tall, with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that carried more sorrow than anger. Strange man, that one, the storekeeper would sometimes say after he left. Been up there all alone for years now. No one could say for sure how long it had been. Some said 10 years, others 15. But everyone agreed that no woman would ever want to be the wife of a man like that. Too rough, too quiet, too cut off from the world. But Elias hadn't always been alone. Once, he'd lived in town like everyone else. He'd been younger, with laughter in his voice and dreams that reached beyond the valley. He'd built houses, fixed wagons, and always lent a hand when someone needed help. And he'd had someone waiting for him at home, a woman with warm eyes and a soft voice who made even the smallest cabin feel like a palace. Her name was Lila, and for a while, their world had been perfect. They had a little girl, Grace, who used to run barefoot through the fields, chasing butterflies and calling out for her father to lift her high in the air. Elias would come home from a long day's work, scoop her up, and the sound of her laughter would echo across the hills. Those were the days that filled his heart so full, he thought it might never break. But life, as it often does, turned cruel without warning. One winter, a sickness swept through the valley. It started as a cough, then a fever that burned too high. By the time Elias could ride for the doctor, it was too late. He buried Lila and Grace beneath the big pine tree near their old home, marking their graves with stones he carved by hand. After that, something inside him went quiet. He left the town a few months later, sold what he had, and went deep into the mountains where no one could find him. Maybe he thought the silence would help him heal. Maybe he just couldn't stand the sound of people's voices when the ones he loved were gone. Years passed that way. Seasons came and went, and though the world around him changed, Elias stayed the same, a ghost of a man trying to find peace in the wilderness. He grew to know the land better than most men know themselves. He could tell when rain was coming by the smell in the air, and he could track a deer through snow as easily as other men read a newspaper. He spoke little, but he listened. To the wind in the trees, the call of birds, the crackle of the fire at night. He found a strange comfort in the company of nature. Still, sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, he would wake to the sound of his own name whispered in his dreams. He'd sit up, heart heavy, staring into the darkness. Rust would lift his head and whine softly, sensing his master's sorrow. Elias would reach out, resting a rough hand on the dog's back. "It's all right, boy," he'd murmur. But his voice would tremble because it wasn't really all right. Not yet. In town, the older folks remembered him kindly, though few ever saw him now. He was a good man once, they'd say. Had a family. Lost 'em both. Ain't no one the same after that. But the younger people, the ones who hadn't known him before, only saw the legend. The mountain man who never smiled, who lived alone like a creature from the woods. They'd make jokes, tell stories around campfires about how he could wrestle a bear or live weeks without food. Most of it wasn't true, but it made for good talk on long winter nights. Elias didn't mind. He didn't care what people said. All he wanted was quiet. One cold morning, he sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the fog lift off the river. The world was painted in shades of gray and gold, and for a moment it almost felt peaceful. He thought about the town below, how people were probably just waking up, how life kept moving for them while his own had stood still for so long. He wondered if they ever thought about him. Probably not. Why would they? He'd chosen his solitude. Yet even in his isolation, Elias had never turned cruel. When storms hit and the river flooded, he'd come down quietly to the edge of town, leaving bundles of firewood or jars of honey on doorsteps before slipping away unseen. He never asked for thanks. He didn't want people to know it was him. It was enough to help in small ways without having to face anyone's pity. There were times when he'd stop by the old church, long after dark, and leave food there for the pastor to give to families who were struggling. He did it not because he wanted redemption, but because kindness still lived somewhere inside him, even if he didn't speak of it. Still, no one saw those moments. To them, he was just the mountain man, lonely, strange, and best left alone. Sometimes when he passed through town, he could feel the eyes on him. Mothers would pull their children close. Men would nod politely but keep their distance. It didn't anger him anymore. He understood fear. People feared what they didn't understand, and no one really understood him. He'd stop by the blacksmith shop, trade a few pelts for supplies, and head back up the road without a word. But every time he turned toward the mountains, a small ache tugged at his chest. Because deep down there was still a part of him that missed belonging somewhere. He missed laughter. He missed warmth. He missed being seen as more than a shadow. That night, as the sun sank behind the ridge, Elias sat by the fire inside his cabin. The flames danced across the walls, throwing soft light on the carvings he'd made over the years. Small wooden animals, birds, and faces that seemed to come to life in the flicker of the fire. They were his only art, his only way of remembering what beauty once felt like. Rust lay by his feet, snoring softly. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and rain. Elias leaned back in his chair, the firelight glinting in his tired eyes. He didn't know that soon. Someone new would come to the valley. Someone who would see past the beard and the silence. Someone who would notice the quiet kindness in the way he moved, the gentleness hidden beneath all those rough edges. But for now, he sat alone, a man shaped by sorrow and silence, living in a world that had forgotten his laughter, and yet, somewhere deep inside beneath the layers of loss and loneliness, his heart still beat with a quiet, stubborn hope. A hope that one day, someone might see him not as the mountain man, but simply as Elias. When spring came to Mill Creek, the snow melted slowly from the mountaintops and the rivers ran fast and clear. The valley turned green again, and wildflowers began to bloom along the roads. It was around that time when a new face arrived. In town, a young woman who carried herself with quiet confidence and a kind smile. Her name was Clara Hayes. She had come from the city after being offered a small teaching job in the valley. The old schoolhouse had been closed for years, and the town council had finally decided it was time to open it again for the children. Clara had always dreamed of teaching somewhere peaceful, far away from the noise of the city. She imagined a quiet life surrounded by nature, where she could make a small difference in people's lives. But Mill Creek wasn't quite what she expected. The people were kind enough, but they were cautious around strangers. They had their ways, and simple, practical, and sometimes suspicious of outsiders. Still, Clara's gentle nature and genuine smile won them over little by little. She rented a small cottage near the edge of town, not far from the old dirt road that led toward the mountains. Every morning, she would walk to the schoolhouse with her books tucked under her arm, her brown hair tied back with a ribbon. The children adored her almost immediately. She taught them with patience, turning every lesson into a story. Her laughter filled the small classroom, and the sound of it spilled out through the open windows, mixing with the breeze and the sound of birds. One afternoon, as she was sweeping the classroom, she overheard two of the older boys whispering near the door. "You ever seen him?" One said, "Who?" the other asked. "The mountain man," the first boy said with wide eyes. "They say he lives way up there past the river. Some folks think he used to be normal. But then something happened. He don't talk to nobody now." Clara smiled softly. "You boys shouldn't gossip," she said kindly. I'm sure he's just someone who prefers to live quietly. But after they left, she found herself thinking about it. The mountain man. The way the boy spoke, half in fear, half in awe. A few days later, when Clara went to the general store to buy supplies, she noticed a tall man standing by the counter. His coat was worn, his hands rough, and his beard thick and gray. He said little, only gave a small nod to the shopkeeper and spoke in a low, calm voice. She saw the way people moved aside for him, whispering softly as he passed. "That's him," the storekeeper said quietly after the man left. "Elias Turner. Been living up in them mountains for years now." Clara turned toward the window, watching as Elias stepped into the sunlight and walked down the dusty road, his dog following close behind. There was something about him, not frightening, not harsh, but deeply lonely. "Doesn't anyone visit him?" she asked. The storekeeper shook his head. "No reason to. He's fine up there on his own. Always has been." That evening, Clara sat on her porch watching the mountains turn orange in the setting sun. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, maybe from his cabin. She wondered what it would be like to live so far from everyone, surrounded by silence. She couldn't imagine it. Over the next few weeks, she saw him a few more times, always at a distance. Once by the river, where he was fishing quietly with his dog beside him. Another time, she spotted him walking through the valley at dawn, carrying a bundle of firewood over his shoulder. He never noticed her and she never called out. But each time she saw him, something in her heart softened a little more. It wasn't pity. It was curiosity and a quiet sense of respect. She started asking questions in town, though she did it gently so as not to seem nosy. Most people told the same story, that Elias had lost his family and gone into the mountains after that. They said he was strange but not dangerous, a man who kept to himself and hurt no one. Still, one of the women at the bakery said, lowering her voice, "You'd best stay clear of him. He's been alone too long. People change when they live that way." Clara nodded politely, but deep down she didn't believe kindness disappeared so easily. Sometimes pain only made it quieter. One cold morning, when the first signs of autumn touched the air, Clara was walking back from the schoolhouse when she noticed a small bundle by the church door. It was wrapped in cloth, and when she bent to look, she found jars of honey and dried meat, food left anonymously. She asked the pastor about it later. He smiled faintly. "It's been happening for years. Nobody ever sees who leaves it, but I reckon we know who it is." "Elias?" she asked softly. The pastor nodded. "He doesn't speak of it. Never asks for thanks. Just leaves what he can, especially when winter's coming." That night, Clara couldn't stop thinking about him. The man everyone said was hard and strange had a gentle habit that no one ever gave him credit for. She began to see him differently, not as a ghost from the mountains, but as a man who had once cared deeply and still did, in his own quiet way. As the days grew shorter, the mountains began to change color again. Golden leaves covered the ground, and the air carried the smell of pine and rain. Clara often walked near the edge of the forest after class, enjoying the peace it brought her. She sometimes caught sight of footprints near the river or saw signs of freshly chopped wood. She wondered if they belonged to Elias. Once she found a small wooden carving of a bird resting on a rock by the path. It looked handmade, smooth and delicate, as if carved with care. She picked it up, turning it over in her hands. It wasn't much, but it felt like a quiet message from someone who spoke more through his actions than words. She took it home and placed it on her windowsill. Every time she looked at it, she thought of the man who had chosen silence over company, and she couldn't help but feel drawn to the mystery of him. The townspeople continued to warn her kindly. "Don't go wandering too close to those woods," they said. "He's harmless, sure, but a man that lives alone that long, well, you just never know." Clara would smile and thank them, but her heart had already decided not to fear him. One afternoon, as she walked back from the schoolhouse, the sky began to darken. A storm was coming fast and the wind howled through the valley. She hurried along the path, clutching her coat tightly, but the rain came hard and cold. By the time she reached her cottage, she was soaked through. She built a fire and sat by the window, watching the trees bend in the wind. In the distance, she thought she saw a faint light flicker, a lantern moving slowly up the mountain path. She knew it had to be him. Elias Turner, the man who came down only when he needed to, was walking through the storm toward the edge of town, probably checking on things, she thought, probably making sure the river didn't flood, or that the animals hadn't strayed too close to the roads. He didn't look for thanks or company. He simply did what he thought was right. That night, Clara sat by the fire long after the rain stopped, thinking about the man with the quiet eyes and the worn hands. She imagined what kind of heart kept doing good even when the world had given nothing back. The next morning, she found a basket on her porch. Inside were 2 jars of honey, a small loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, and a note written in a rough but careful hand. Found this near the river. Figured you could use it. The storms are bad up here. Be careful on the road, no name. But she didn't need one. She smiled, holding the note close. For the first time since she'd come to Mill Creek, Clara felt something shift inside her, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Somewhere beyond the trees, in a small cabin by the river, a man who the world had forgotten was still capable of quiet kindness. And though she didn't know it yet, their paths were slowly beginning to intertwine. 2 lonely souls who would soon discover that even the deepest pain could be healed by the gentlest heart. The winter that year came early and came hard. Snow began to fall before the leaves had even finished turning, and the cold air rolled down from the mountains like a warning. The people of Mill Creek hurried to prepare, chopping wood, stocking food, sealing their windows tight. Clara had grown used to the chill, but she hadn't faced a mountain winter before. Her small cottage, though cozy, wasn't built for the kind of storms that tore through the valley. The wind howled through the cracks, and sometimes it sounded like a voice calling out in the dark. Still, she tried to keep her spirits up. Every day she lit her stove, made tea, and graded her students' papers by the fire. She thought often about Elias Turner, the quiet mountain man who had left a basket on her porch before the last storm. She had never seen him again since then, but sometimes when she walked by the river, she found small signs that he had passed that way. A freshly cut log, a trail of footprints, or once a handmade snare left neatly by the water. She knew he moved silently through the valley, always watching over things even when no one noticed. It gave her a strange sense of comfort to know he was out there. The first big snow came in early December. The sky turned white and heavy, and the town seemed to disappear under a blanket of silence. People stayed indoors, and only the sound of shovels and church bells broke through the stillness. Clara's school had closed for the winter break, and though she enjoyed the quiet, there were moments when she felt the deep ache of loneliness. One night, as the wind screamed outside, she sat by her window and looked toward the mountains. Somewhere up there, Elias was alone in his cabin. She wondered how he spent his evenings, if he still carved wood by the fire, if he ever thought about the world below. The storm raged for 3 days straight. On the 4th night, the wind grew so fierce that the trees around her cottage began to sway dangerously. Clara woke to a loud crack, and before she could react, the roof above her bedroom gave way. Snow and wood came crashing down, and the last thing she remembered was the sound of glass shattering and the world turning white. When she opened her eyes again, everything was quiet. The first thing she saw was the soft glow of firelight. The second was a rough wooden ceiling above her head. Her body ached, but she was warm, wrapped in blankets, lying on a narrow bed. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then she heard the sound of footsteps and turned her head. Elias stood near the fire, stirring something in a pot. His dog Rust lay curled by the hearth, snoring softly. "You're awake," Elias said quietly, his voice low but calm. "You took a bad hit when the roof came down. Found you near the edge of the river." Clara tried to sit up, but pain shot through her shoulder. He turned quickly and gently pressed a hand against her arm. "Easy now," he said. "You'll be all right. Just need rest." She looked around the cabin. It was simple but warm. Thick logs for walls, shelves lined with jars, a table made from rough wood. There was something peaceful about the place, something alive. "How long have I been here?" she asked softly. 2 days, he said. "Storm's been too strong to take you back down." Clara glanced toward the window. Outside, snow was still falling in thick white sheets. The world beyond looked frozen, untouched. "Thank you," she whispered. "You saved me." Elias shrugged slightly as if the thought didn't mean much. "Wasn't right to leave you there." But she could see the care in everything he'd done, the way the fire was kept steady, the fresh bandages on her arm, the cup of water placed beside her bed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled softly and Rust shifted in his sleep. Finally, Clara broke the silence. "People said you liked being alone," she said gently. "But you don't seem like a man who'd turn his back on others." He looked up then, his eyes catching the firelight. "People say a lot of things they don't understand," she nodded. "That's true." For the next few days, she stayed in the cabin, slowly regaining her strength. Elias moved quietly around the place, tending to chores, cooking, feeding the fire. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his voice carried a warmth that surprised her. One morning, she woke to the sound of snow falling from the roof. Elias was by the table, carving something from a block of wood. She watched him for a while before speaking. "What are you making?" He looked up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Nothing special. Just something to pass the time." He handed it to her. It was a small carving of a bird, its wings half spread as if ready to fly. "It's beautiful," she said softly. He shrugged again, but his eyes softened. "Used to make them for my little girl," he said quietly. "She loved birds. Said they were God's messengers." Clara's heart tightened. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't have to. The way he looked at the carving told her everything. The loss, the love, the years of silence that followed. Later that evening, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him speaking softly to Rust. "Didn't think I'd ever have someone else in here again," he said. "Feels strange, but maybe not so bad." Clara smiled quietly under the blanket, pretending not to hear. Days passed, and slowly the storm began to fade. The snow outside grew lighter, and the gray sky turned pale blue. Clara felt stronger, though she secretly wished she could stay just a little longer. There was a peace in that cabin that she hadn't known in a long time. Sometimes she helped Elias with small tasks, chopping vegetables, drying herbs, brushing the snow from the porch. He never let her do much, insisting she was still recovering. But she liked to stay busy. Once, while they were sitting by the fire, she said softly, "You're not what people think you are." "You know." Elias looked at her, brow raised slightly. "And what do people think I am?" "They think you're cold," she said. "Distant. Like you don't care about anyone." He gave a quiet laugh, deep and low, like he hadn't used that sound in years. "I suppose I gave them reason to think that. But it isn't true," she said. He looked into the fire, his face thoughtful. "Maybe not. But sometimes when you've lost too much, being alone feels safer." Clara understood that more than she wanted to admit. She'd come to Mill Creek to escape her own losses. The noise, the city, the memories that wouldn't stop following her. She had hoped the quiet would heal her, and perhaps it had. But now she realized that quiet wasn't the same as peace. That night, the sky cleared, and for the first time in days, the stars shone bright through the cabin window. Elias stepped outside for a moment, and Clara followed, wrapped in a blanket. The snow sparkled under the moonlight, untouched and endless. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He nodded. "It's the only thing that ever made sense after everything else stopped making sense." She looked at him then, not the way the town saw him, as the mountain man, but as someone who had loved deeply and lost more than most people could bear. And yet, even after all that, he still found kindness in his heart. For the first time, she saw the man behind the silence. The next morning, Elias helped her pack a few things for the trip back to town. The path would be rough, but the snow had settled enough to make it passable. Rust walked ahead, clearing the way. Before she left, she turned back to him. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Elias looked at her for a long moment. "Maybe," he said quietly. "The mountains don't let go of people that easy," she smiled. "Then maybe I'll have to come back and visit." He gave a small nod, and though his words were few, his eyes said what he couldn't. "Thank you for not being afraid of me." As she walked down the trail, the cold air biting her cheeks, Clara felt something new in her chest. A warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the blanket she carried. It was the warmth of knowing that even in the coldest places, hearts could still be gentle. And somewhere behind her, in a cabin by the river, a man who had long stopped believing in connection stood watching the path disappear, feeling something he hadn't felt in years: hope. When Clara returned to Mill Creek, the townspeople were surprised to see her walking down from the mountain road with a torn coat, flushed cheeks, and a story she didn't tell. The pastor found her first and helped her get home. She explained that her roof had caved in during the storm, that she'd been rescued by someone who'd found her half buried in snow. She didn't mention a name, but somehow the town already guessed. By the next day, everyone was whispering. It was him, the shopkeeper said behind the counter. The mountain man brought her down, carried her through the snow himself. He must have been the one, said a woman at the bakery. Strange how he shows up now after all these years. Some people were thankful that he'd saved her, but others were suspicious. Old stories had a way of making people forget kindness. He's not right in the head, one man muttered at the tavern. A man who lives that long alone ain't fit for company. Clara ignored it. She was grateful, deeply grateful, and that was enough for her. She had seen the truth for herself. Elias wasn't a monster or a ghost from the woods. He was quiet, yes, but gentle, careful and kind in ways that didn't need words. As the weeks passed, her cottage was repaired with the help of the townsfolk. She returned to teaching, though she caught people watching her curiously, wondering what had really happened up there in that cabin. She didn't try to explain. Some things she thought were too pure to be spoiled by gossip. Every morning she walked past the edge of the forest and looked toward the mountains. She couldn't see his cabin, of course, but she knew it was there, standing among the pines, with smoke curling from the chimney. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the trees, a figure in the distance watching over the valley, but by the time she looked again it was gone. Winter faded slowly into spring, and the snow gave way to green once more. One afternoon, Clara took a basket of bread, jam, and coffee beans, and began walking up the mountain path. She told herself she just wanted to thank him properly, but in truth she missed the calm of his presence, the quiet understanding that had passed between them. The climb was hard, and the wind still sharp, but when she reached the river bend, she saw Rust before she saw Elias. The old dog wagged his tail and barked once before trotting toward her. Elias appeared a moment later, stepping out from behind a tree with his usual calm, though his expression softened when he saw her. "You shouldn't have come all this way," he said. "I owed you thanks," she replied, smiling, "and maybe a cup of coffee." He looked at the basket and then back at her. "You didn't need to do that." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." He hesitated, then stepped aside and motioned for her to follow. The cabin looked just as she remembered, sturdy, quiet, smelling faintly of smoke and pine. She sat by the fire while he brewed the coffee, and for a while they just talked. Not about heavy things, not about loss or loneliness, but about the land, the weather, the small things that made up their days. Clara found herself laughing again, something she hadn't done freely in a long time. Elias listened more than he spoke, but when he did talk, his words carried meaning. "You know," she said softly, "the town still talks about you." He gave a short, knowing smile. "They always have. Most of them don't understand you," she continued. "But I think they would if they knew you like I do." Elias shook his head. "Doesn't matter what they think. I stopped living for other people's approval a long time ago." "But don't you ever miss them?" she asked gently. "People, I mean, conversation, laughter." He looked into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Sometimes. But then I remember how it felt when I lost everything." Silence was the only thing that made sense after that. Clara didn't speak. She understood. "You should go," he said quietly. "The trail will freeze soon." "I'm not leaving you like this," she replied firmly. He smiled faintly. "You always were stubborn." She ignored him and went outside to gather wood. The sky was clear but bitterly cold, the kind of cold that stung the skin and made every breath hurt. When she came back, he was watching her. "You remind me of her," he said softly. Clara paused. "Your wife?" He nodded. "She was strong. Never backed down from anything. Used to tell me I worried too much." Clara smiled sadly. "Maybe she was right." "Maybe," he whispered. Over the next few days, she stayed in the cabin, caring for him. She boiled herbs, fed him warm soup, and kept the fire alive day and night. Sometimes he was strong enough to talk. Other times he slept for hours. She told him stories from town about the children's Christmas play, about how the mayor had slipped on ice and blamed it on his boots, about how the townsfolk still gossiped but secretly admired his courage for living up here alone. He listened with quiet amusement, his eyes soft. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow pressed against the windows, he spoke suddenly. "I used to think the mountain was a punishment," he said, "a place to hide from everything I'd lost. But maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was waiting for me to heal, and maybe you were part of that." Clara's throat tightened. "You don't need to thank me, Elias." "I'm not," he said gently. I'm just realizing that peace doesn't always come the way we expect. The firelight flickered across his face, tracing the lines of time and solitude that had shaped him. Clara looked at him and thought about how people in town had called him strange, dangerous, broken, and how wrong they all were. He was none of those things. He was just human, bruised, scarred, but still capable of kindness. When morning came again, the storm had stopped. The world outside was white and silent. Russ barked weakly at the door, his tail thumping. Clara smiled, relieved, but when she turned back to Elias, she saw he was sitting up, watching her. You need to go back today, he said quietly. You've stayed long enough. Not until I know you're better. I'm better because of you, he said. But I don't want you caught here when the next storm hits. She hesitated. Will you come down to the valley when spring comes? He didn't answer right away. Then after a moment he said, Maybe. If I do, it'll be to see you. She felt her cheeks flush, but she smiled. Then I'll wait for you. When she finally left that afternoon, the snow was deep but manageable. Rust walked with her partway down the trail before turning back, his fur brushing against her hand as if saying goodbye. She turned one last time and saw Elias standing by the door, leaning slightly but strong enough to wave. She waved back, her heart heavy and full all at once. The rest of winter passed slowly. Clara went back to her work, though she thought about him every day. The children noticed her staring out the window sometimes, lost in thought. As spring crept in, she began to check the mountains again for smoke. Weeks passed and nothing. Then one morning she saw it, a thin ribbon rising into the sky. Her heart lifted. He was alive. A few days later, she heard footsteps outside the schoolhouse. When she looked up, there he was, standing in the doorway, clean-shaven, his hair trimmed, wearing an old but tidy coat. He looked different, still rugged, still quiet, but lighter somehow, as if a weight had finally lifted. The children stared in awe. He smiled gently and tipped his hat. I promised I'd come down, he said. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She crossed the room and threw her arms around him before she could stop herself. He laughed, a deep, warm sound that made the whole room seem brighter. In the weeks that followed, Elias began helping in the town, fixing fences, mending roofs, chopping wood for those who couldn't. At first, people kept their distance, but slowly, they began to see what Clara had seen all along. He wasn't strange or dangerous. He was kind, quietly kind. Children brought him apples, old women sent pies to his door, and even the men who once called him the hermit now nodded respectfully when they passed. One evening, as the sun set over the valley, Clara and Elias stood by the river watching the water shimmer in gold light. You changed things, she said softly. He shook his head. You did. You believed in what others couldn't see. Clara smiled. Maybe we both did. For a long time they stood there without speaking, the sound of the river filling the silence. Then he reached for her hand, not hesitantly, but with quiet certainty, and in that moment, the mountain man who once lived in silence and the woman who once lived in fear of loneliness found something neither had expected: peace, and the gentle warmth of belonging. The mountain still stood tall behind them, strong and eternal, but it no longer felt like a place of exile. It was home, and for the first time in years, Elias felt the world open again, not with grand words or promises, but with the simple truth that sometimes love doesn't need to be loud to be real. It just needs to be kind.